Hello, welcome to the Coronavirus Diaries. My name is Marie Lamenche. Today I'm very happy to welcome here Florian Bieber, who is a professor in Southeastern European History and Politics and the director of the Center for Southeast European Studies at the University of Graz. And you also contribute to Foreign Policy magazine, which is how I kind of got to know you. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Um, at the beginning of the pandemic, nationalist and populist leaders and movements seemed completely unable and unprepared to deal with such a crisis that is both local and global. Why is that so?
Well, I mean, to some degree, of course, the enemy is not at first a migrant or somebody different, but it's a disease. So that makes it a lot harder for nationalists and populists to kind of blame somebody. And the second thing is, of course, that many of them have been promoting non-scientific approaches to politics. I mean, populists are notoriously skeptical about expertise and expert-driven policymaking. I mean, they've been sort of with the dominant rhetoric of nationalist populists has been to say, we don't need experts, we know better. The people know better what is needed. Now, of course, this has led to disastrous miscalculations. I mean, we've seen it both in Britain and the United States, but also elsewhere, like in Brazil, where populist leaders have not taken the pandemic seriously and were caught really off guard when they had to realize that, in fact, their laissez-faire approach in many ways was really not very helpful for their own popularity at the end of the day, because as the risk and the disease became more apparent that it would be threatening the population, you couldn't really just ignore its threat, and you had to listen to experts. So that was, I think, why the kind of populist stream of politics, at least in many countries around the world, at first was caught a little bit off guard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've seen a lot of nationalism growing in Europe, and we've seen a real democratic decline around the world, and that includes in Europe. How could Europe and perhaps the rest of the world become even less democratic once the pandemic calms down? And how is the current situation kind of exacerbating existing tensions in Europe specifically?
Well, certainly the pandemic has, to some degree, worsened some pre-existing tensions. I mean, I think what we see is in a moment of crisis, people look at the state and they expect the state to act. And of course, this comes often at the detriment of transnational cooperation. Citizens and states often behave selfishly, so to speak. So governments are seeking to procure medical supplies for their own citizens, often ignoring the needs elsewhere. So I think we see this really in the last weeks very strongly, that there is at least a temptation in the first reflex to be quote unquote selfish in their response. And this is, of course, creates tensions because different countries feel they're disadvantaged by one another. We've seen this in Europe a lot, that also with the breakdown of the freedom of movement, border closures, and also the limitations on export of certain goods, all of a sudden what was self-evident until a month ago, namely a free market with open borders for citizens, disappeared within weeks. Now, there's, of course, there are medical grounds of some of those restrictions, but some of them are kind of national selfishness, you could say. And, it's easy to say, well, the EU should have done more, but in most cases, when we're looking at what happened, is that the EU as an institution doesn't have the competence. Mm-hmm. And states, when push came to shove, acted selfishly and were not willing to really coordinate and to cooperate on these crucial issues. This, at least, is the first response. I mean, again, down the road, I think things might look a little bit different, and already now they look different than they did a few weeks ago at the beginning of the pandemic.
Do you think Europe will, once it opens its borders again to freedom of movement and goods, do you think there'll be more regulations than there used to be? Do you think some kind of restrictions will remain in the long term?
I mean, I think that kind of comes back a little bit to your previous questions about will the countries be more or less democratic or less democratic after the crisis. And I think what we have to be very careful about is that the kind of lots of emergency restrictions we're seeing at the moment are, of course, temporary, and many of them seem without doubt justified. I mean, restrictions on gatherings, on people going out. But I think that what we have to be careful about is several things. First of all, lack of proportionality, that some of these measures are more drastic than they need to be, or that they are reinforced in a manner which is disproportionate. So, for example, some countries have instituted prison fines for spreading fake news. Now, that seems very dangerous because who is to determine what is fake news? Or other countries have sent military patrols on the street to reinforce restrictions on movement. Now, that strikes me as very dangerous because once you start using the army for domestic purposes, it sends a signal, first of all, that this is a kind of a state of war, and also a very kind of militarized understanding of the crisis. Now, I don't think you need to keep pensioners indoors or people in small groups with the use of the army. This seems really disproportionate. So that's the first risk. And the second one is really about the long-term durability of these measures. Now, probably the most radical ones are going to be eased in nearly all countries once the crisis is less kind of dominant. But I'm concerned that some of those measures might just be used much beyond that. I mean, we're looking at tracking of citizens, for example, through mobile phones. This is something which I think will be very tempting for governments to use even in quote unquote normal times. So there, I think there's a real risk that some of those restrictions are going to stay with us if not properly checked. And of course, the same goes with border controls in the European Union, that already border controls have gotten more rigid, or at least to become more visible after the so-called migration crisis of 2015. But that didn't affect let's say, the privileged citizens of the European Union who could travel freely, but now they are, of course, limited as well. Whether or not we're going to have a quick return to the freedom of movement we're used to, or many, let's say, from more privileged countries are used to, is something which is also far from clear. I mean, down the road probably, but how long this state of exception will take is really quite uncertain.
Yeah, and we saw this, not only with the Patriot Act in the United States after 9/11, but also in France after the Bataclan attack. The state of emergency kind of kept being renewed. And myself, having family in France, I know that whenever I go there now, I see still a lot of armed military men on the street. So, I mean, that's, I think, what you were saying is it kind of a more long-term, perhaps dangerous, that we just get used to seeing this kind of militarized response on the street.
Yeah, people get used to it. I mean, this is, I think, human beings have a great coping mechanism that they find a normality in even extraordinary circumstances. But that coping mechanism can also be dangerous, that in times of crisis, people then accept these measures and then get so used to them that few people might be really critical about them once circumstances return to normal, so that we don't even notice when normal begins again. I mean, in the United States, I think your example of 9/11 is perfect. For many years, you had the state, TVs had a broadcast where they say the alertness state, where it's, is it in red, orange, or green, as if in Kansas you have to worry as much as in New York City about the threat level. But it's this kind of securitization which is dangerous, because it's not just that it uses it kind of normalize the use of kind of security actors, but also because it keeps people in a state of anxiety. It kind of says you are living in a state of emergency, and states of emergency justify governments of doing all kinds of things. For example, now already in the United States, we see that migrants, undocumented migrants at the border, are sent back without due process. So it's easy to do away with certain protections in these times. And probably 90% of the population will not be affected, but the risk is that the most vulnerable ones, migrants who are not documented, or other groups which are more vulnerable, become the target then, and the majority might just stand by because they're told that this is just the way we have to deal with this extraordinary circumstance, in a way in which most citizens might not tolerate those measures in quote unquote normal times.
Yeah. And before we go into what is happening specifically in Hungary, why do you think that populist or authoritarian regimes and leaders tend to actually use these crises to crack down even more on civil rights and basic freedoms, and how do they take advantage of this crisis to actually consolidate power? Is it a question of legitimacy, or do they have this reaction?
Well, I think, the authoritarian populists, and I think there's a close link between authoritarianism and populism, because populists believe in a dichotomous world where there's good and bad, and the true will of the people. And they're also very much opposing the restrictions on the majority will, the idea that there's an absolute will of the majority and it shouldn't be restrained by minority rights protection or institutional safeguards. And that's why we see populists attacking the judiciary, for example, which is the institution which really protects the rule of law, and with it the right of minorities. I mean all kinds of minorities, from political to sexual to national minorities, to be protected. So I think there's a strong link between authoritarianism and populism. And of course, in that sense, the instincts are authoritarian. And so in that sense, any opportunity given will be used to reinforce authoritarian rule, either opportunistically or out of conviction. And in these moments, first of all, you can gather great popular consent. Governments, usually executives, soar in popularity in moments of crisis. They are easy to justify, and we've seen in many countries that opposition who is critical is called, allies of the virus, pro-corona opposition. We've heard these phrases. So the suggestion that the opposition, by being critical of certain measures, is siding with the enemy, and that enemy is the disease. So it's very hard to criticize it. It's easy to shut down critical voices. And of course, on an international level, the attention is elsewhere. And if France does it, if the United States do it, if liberal democracies take such measures, or even similar measures, it's very easy for autocrats to justify the erosion of these freedoms by pointing out to, let's say, well-established democracies.
So yeah, let's talk about the situation in Hungary, because I think it's a good kind of textbook example of authoritarian regimes or leaders kind of benefiting from the state of emergency and taking more control. What is happening there? And obviously he's using this moment because no one within NATO or the European Union is really looking at it, because everybody is focused on their own country and population. So what has Viktor Orban been doing there?
Well, Viktor Orban's party has passed a law a few days ago, which basically declares a state of emergency, which allows the government to act to suspend existing laws without the consent of parliament. It allows to rule without parliament for an indefinite period. So there isn't a sunset clause built into the law. It can be suspended only with the will of the government itself. So in a certain way, the government checks itself, no longer checked by parliament. And also the law has been passed with a 2/3 majority, so it's very difficult to change back. So in that sense, it protects, it locks in a certain way the current government. And so in a certain, it basically reduces the checks and balances to an absolute minimum and gives the government great hand in imposing whatever decisions it wants to do. And it has, for example, already subsequently taken decision on rights of sexual minorities, which have really absolutely nothing to do with the crisis. So I think we can see that the government has been using this as a pretext for further control, rather than just dealing, with the epidemic measures. Now, this is not a full surprise. The government of Viktor Orban in Hungary has been eroding democratic checks and balances for a decade now. They came to power exactly 10 years ago, and they've passed a new constitution. They've passed a whole set of so-called cardinal laws, which are passed with a large constitutional majority, which they've changed the electoral system. So many observers have noted that Hungary is already for a number of years no longer a democracy. Freedom House declares it partly free. Varieties of democracies, a kind of measure of democracies around the world, has also recently come out saying that Hungary is no longer a kind of full democratic system. many studies, again, by scholars of democracy come to the same conclusion, that Hungary is no longer a democratic country in the sense of a democratic country where there is the ability to change government through free and fair elections. This is no longer given. The media is controlled. So we have a very, very oppressive environment, and a government which has used this particular opportunity in a certain way to further consolidate its power. Especially this comes, of course, as we discussed earlier, because it can get away with it, but also because opposition is there. And not long ago, it lost the capital of Budapest to the opposition. So the opposition can organize itself. It's very, very difficult. It's certainly not a free and fair environment, but it's certainly useful in this moment for the government to reassert itself when there's more criticism than there has been for a decade of its rule.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen other countries in Europe go along the same route? Perhaps, I don't know, what's happening in Poland, for example? Do you know a bit more about that?
I mean, in Poland, we haven't seen the same kind of laws. What we've seen in Poland, and what I think has been noted as worrying, is that the government is planning to go ahead with presidential elections planned for May. Now, that seems both from a public health perspective highly irresponsible, but also favors the incumbent, because in these circumstances, you cannot have electoral campaigns. I mean, you can't go and organize a rally. You can't, talk to your supporters in the way in which elections are normally contested. So it favors the incumbent. In these circumstances, elections always favor the one who holds power, partly because there is, in moments of crisis, a kind of rallying around the flag, around the leader phenomena, but also because he's the only one who can campaign by virtue of being the president. So we see there also, in a different way, an abuse. And we have other countries in Europe as well. In Serbia, we have a state of emergency, which is quite restrictive. Also there, we've had regulations on public information, which led to the arrest of a journalist who was criticizing healthcare provision. So this was not spreading fake news in the sense of spreading rumors or dubious explanations of the spread of the disease, but rather criticizing the public health response, which certainly is something which should never be covered by any kind of restrictions, because it's exactly that which makes situation worse rather than better. She was released, and the government promised to drop these restrictive measures, but it shows you that governments are also testing about how far they can go. And in Serbia, we have, for example, very strict curfew. Elderly people above 65 are not allowed to leave the house at all, except for a very small time slot in the morning. These kind of measures really seem disproportionate in many ways. And we have also similar kind of disproportionate measures in Albania. In Montenegro, the government has publicly made available the names of individuals who are supposed to be self-quarantined because they are considered to be coming from an area of particular threat. The government justified it by saying kind of social coercion will work better than policing because we don't have the police to keep a check on everybody. But it seems very problematic to list publicly the name and address of individuals who are supposed to be quarantined. So we see governments across the continent taking these measures which shouldn't extend beyond what we consider to be proportional with the interest of the public. And that's, I think, what is worrying. Again, it's too early to say exactly how all of this will pan out, but I think we do see more than one country where the response of the government seems to be going a bit beyond what might be strictly really necessary and might really curtail civil liberties to a degree which is worrying.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of, I mean, you're a professor of nationalism, and we've seen that a lot in Europe over the past few years. We've heard a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, xenophobic speech, and perhaps a rise of anti-Semitism as well. Are these perhaps more extreme, let's say extreme right movements, for example, using this moment to call for even more, nationalism and less, and perhaps is Euroscepticism growing right now as well?
I mean, it's certainly the hope of the far right that this will be their moment. Nigel Farage, in an early editorial a month ago, wrote that we're all nationalists now. Now, I wouldn't agree with him, but certainly it's well, on one side, the far right populists have lost at first their topics because nobody cares about migrants, particularly now. That also is to the disadvantage of migrants. There are tens of thousands of migrants stranded in Greece in a very precarious situation, and they're not getting the help they should. They often don't have water, and certainly not the facilities to keep the level of hygiene to be able to prevent the spread of disease. So in a certain way, you can't social distance if you live in a refugee camp. And nobody cares about that because this is not on the agenda. But of course, this also means that for populist far-right parties, you can't really talk about migration at the moment. But again, I think they're trying to capture this issue for that and link migration and border closures with the disease. And it's a matter of whether they will succeed or not. I mean, in many ways, I think in the European Union, decision makers have realized that if they don't show, not just are offering aid, and we've seen this now that, for example, patients have been flown from French hospitals to German hospitals where their capacities, or Austrian hospitals. So there is cross-border transfer of patients, medical supply. I mean, there's been more medical supplies given across the European Union than from China, although the Chinese assistance has been much better publicized. The EU has, in a certain way, the countries have to be better at doing the PR, not to lose the PR war. I mean, provide the assistance, but not be good at selling it. I mean, this has been generally a problem often. But I think there's a realization that this has to be done. And we saw this, for example, in Serbia, where China was quick to provide some assistance, and the Serbian president publicly thanked China and called China a big brother, while at the same time saying the European solidarity is a fairy tale. Since then, there's been a lot more assistance from the European Union, higher in number, volume than from China, but it's gotten a lot less attention. So it's to some degree not about the reality. I mean, of course, there's much which is left to be desired when it comes to solidarity in Europe and elsewhere. But I think there is more solidarity there than is visible. And one has to be careful not to give the far right and nationalists too much ground on that and let them be the ones who interpret what is going on. I mean, I would hold against it and say that, in fact, there is a lot of evidence of solidarity. A lot of people were helping each other out across national boundaries, and one shouldn't believe the nationalists that we are all now following their tracks.
Yeah, we've seen a real also charm offensive from China in Italy. Kind of providing humanitarian aid, as they say. And I think you're right. I think that Europe should obviously do a better PR campaign, but we've seen China doing this propaganda all across the globe in order to kind of save its reputation after it was at the origin of kind of this crisis, and of it denied the virus for kind of quite a long time, and now it's Europe, it's doing its kind of propaganda or PR campaign, as you say.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is. But it risks also backfiring. I mean, I think what we see is that some of this PR is a bit too crude. I mean, sometimes there's been issues in recent days when some of the medical supplies provided by China were in fact purchased in the European Union, while China tried to sell it as a humanitarian donation. And that kind of disinformation is really something which can be debunked fairly easily. And there's a risk that there's risk for China that if it does it in a certain way too crudely, that it will backfire. There's also been lots of reports across EU countries where some of these supplies have been received that they were faulty and of low quality, so that they couldn't be used. So again, I think this might have been an early propaganda victory for China, but whether that in the long term really convinces people that China is a friend who really can offer assistance, I'm not convinced about that. I'm quite doubtful, but it's also worrying in a certain way that we had this in Hungary, for example. One of the opposition MPs criticizing Orban's politics said, help comes from Europe and the virus comes from China. Again, it's also dangerous to rephrase the disease and also the whole talk about it as the Chinese virus and talking about it in this global antagonism. So I mean, yes, we need European solidarity, and we need to be careful that some of the Chinese engagement is propaganda, but at the same time, the response shouldn't be to say, you know, China is the problem and Europeans or Americans for themselves. So in a certain way, we also have to not throw kind of global solidarity, global cooperation overboard in all of that, because you know, China certainly mishandled a lot of the early parts of this pandemic, and it's an authoritarian state, but it's also, you know, it also shouldn't be everything wholesale dismissed about it, so that we're getting into a new phase of kind of a Cold War where, you know, we're full of anti-Chinese stereotypes and biases.
Yeah, and that's one of the goal of this series as well, is to show that there is a lot of propaganda out there, a lot of misinformation, and nobody is you know, same as happening in the United States, where they're pointing at China as you know, the culprit, like even state leaders. What's the state of misinformation and disinformation in Europe? Because here, at least in North America, there's been quite a lot, and it takes a long time to debunk everything that can be found online. What's it like in Europe?
But I think we're also seeing, of course, a lot of you know, rumors spreading. I mean, it's a classic phenomenon in times of uncertainty and great anxiety. People are looking for information and often are not sufficiently critical, and then this is compounded by, of course, the use of social media. You know, and to some degree, when we're locked in inside, we're even less, in a certain way, losing maybe our critical capacity. So yes, of course, we have a lot of that everywhere. Some of it is just because people, you know, all kinds of people spread all kinds of rubbish. Some of it is, of course, deliberate targeting. I think Russia and China are two countries which have been engaging, I think Russia even more than China, in deliberate misinformation. In Europe, we know from many efforts when it comes to Brexit, to elections and elsewhere, channels like Sputnik and so on, which really share misinformation with a deliberate political agenda. And we see this in Europe, just like we do in North America. So again, I think my hope is that when the kind of fog, the fogs of uncertainty lift a little bit, that this will become a lot clearer. But it is, I think the problem is, as you rightly say, that a big story of, you know, there was a story, for example, of masks destined for Italy, which were held in the Czech Republic. And it at first was presented as the Czech Republic confiscating masks masks destined by humanitarian aid from China to Italy. But then it turned out to be a much more complicated story, where these were purchased and sold twice with dubious middlemen. And there was all kinds of much more complicated story, which is not a nice story of Europeans are fighting against one another despite Chinese help, but rather than this was a story of you know, illegal business, dubious practices, corruption, and so on, which is a lot harder to disentangle. It requires serious journalism, and I think this requires more time than the quick story. So yes, I think a lot of the information we got at first, and which were easily and widely shared, will turn out to be not quite as true as they seemed at first. So I think one has to just, you know, give it some time. And I think that the one good thing is certainly that public information, you know, especially in Europe, we have a lot of public broadcasters which are doing their job. And I think what we see is the role of the, you know, of critical journalism, which is done also through public broadcasters, which is able to counteract some of that. And so in that sense, I think that the debunking of myths in a certain way is easier to some degree, because there's a kind of consensus of the mainstream political parties and the society to do so, and the kind of expert-driven advice has greater space in it than it does when it comes to other issues.
Yeah, it's the same here in Canada, actually. People have been turning more to the more traditional, long existing media for information. And I think, you know, I mean, that's the case in Canada. I'm not sure what it is like south of the border. But perhaps to finish on a more kind of positive news, do you have some example of good European collaboration? I know there's been a bit, you were saying there's been a bit more in the recent days.
Well, I think the collaboration is certainly happening in the level of provision for patients in need of urgent care. I mean, I think this is something where we see now an increasing network of countries helping each other out with providing medical assistance to patients when hospital capacities, especially intensive care capacities, are exhausted in one country, that patients are flown to another country. So this has become quite widespread, especially from Italy and France, where there's been a really crisis of local public health systems. I mean, especially it's been particularly pronounced in Eastern France. It's on the border with Germany, and then those patients were taken to just across the border to Germany or to Luxembourg or to Switzerland. So I think this kind of cooperation, and this is really saves lives, because what we find is that the death rate is the highest in places where the public health system is overwhelmed by cases. So this is going on. I mean, of course, the larger question where solidarity is more difficult is when it comes to the long-term financial burden sharing. But on the level of now the kind of care for patients, we see a lot of that, and a lot of also symbolic acts of sympathy or expressing solidarity with Italy, which is a particularly difficult situation. So we see I think we see that quite clearly. So I find that the kind of citizens sympathy and the state's response, it takes a while to get off the ground. I mean, there's logistical reasons, there's the panic at first, but I think as things kind of, I mean, I don't want to say normalize, but as there's a mechanism develop over time of how to handle it, it gets easier to help out one another. And I do see it as something which is kind of working. And some of those help is offered by, in Germany, some individual states have been offering it. So it's not just at the national level, the government level. So it happens at all levels, that we see the solidarity, and in that sense, I mean, that wouldn't have happened without the European Union. So a lot of these kind of cooperation is not organized by the EU as an institution, but it's within that framework of people who are used to each other, who are used to helping each other, where there are communication networks and channels where this is taking place. So in that sense, I mean, that gives me a sense also of optimism that, with all the difficulties and all the kind of challenges to the existing systems, there's also an opportunity to demonstrate that, that people help each other irrespective of their citizenship and nationality, and in a certain way debunk the claims of the nationalists who claim that everybody's now following their line. I don't think that's true, and I think there's plenty of evidence for that.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Bieber, for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you.
And have a good evening.
Yes, likewise. All the best.